All right, welcome back to the second of these supplementary videos for our investigation into Aristotle's politics and his ethics. So, the first one, the social backdrop that I talked about, part one, was on slavery and what we think may have been the views that Aristotle would have encountered when he arrives in Athens as a young man. And of course, maybe in the regions in Sagira where he's from, he might have had those views there as well. But I'm just trying to give you a feel for what may have arguably been the case, as far as we can tell, for the kind of cultural milieu into which Aristotle was educated at the academy with Plato. And of course, where he did a lot of his own work. So now I want to look at what seems to be the case for the views of women. And yes, it is not the views of men. The views of men are more or less articulated in the works like the Nicomachean Ethics. So we have to kind of go outside these works to look for the views of women. But fortunately and unfortunately, fortunately we have a lot of stuff that's about women, but unfortunately it's all written by men. All right, so the life of the polis, as we saw from Solon's reforms, and I skipped over a number of things, but basically the idea that there had to be some kind of equality. And I put that in scare quotes because it doesn't mean they were all identical and they all equal powers, but some attempts to level the playing field. But the life of the polis was really unquestionably for the males of the society. And the free males, not the slaves. And it wasn't really for the women either. They participated at best, if you want to put it this way, indirectly through their households, and the households participated through the head of the household, male, in the life of the polis. So truly, it does set up what a lot of feminist scholars have pointed out. Okay, so if we truly become human beings in the polis, in the life of the polis, only males get to be true human beings because they're the only ones that are really out there, hanging around the coffee shops and doing all the talking, thinking about philosophy and all the other things, working in the market, doing all these things that contribute to our old friend eudaimonia, the real life. This sort of, as we saw again at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, true eudaimonia would be the development of all the virtues, that lesser kind of notion of eudaimonia, or the greater notion of eudaimonia, the higher one, the true life of contemplation. Well, if that's the case, it looks largely that it's completely denied to slaves. Aristotle says, forget them. They don't even really have lives. And arguably, it's not really available to women either. So women don't get to be really human beings in the thought of the Greeks and in Aristotle because they don't participate. They were barred, banned, restricted from being in the life of the polis. Okay, so what else can we say? Well, as I mentioned earlier, when I talk about women in this time, I'm not talking about Spartan women. So Athenian women, not Spartan women. Just as a note, Spartan women, from what we understand, could own property. So it seems that they could inherit it, they could control it a little bit. They were also encouraged to train in the military. Sparta was, of course, a heavily militarized society, to say the least, and women were encouraged to go to the gymnasiums. But what were they really encouraged to work out for? So they could be healthier and produce stronger Spartan children. So produce healthy females so they could produce more Spartan children, and to produce healthy males so that they could be better Spartan soldiers. So even there, they may have had a little bit more quote-unquote freedom in a very small sense of that term, but it was largely geared towards the narrow functions of home life, and ultimately giving birth and raising children. Athenian women, no property. They weren't really encouraged to exercise. They were basically in the household, living there, doing their thing of running the whole household, maybe a little bit of work in textiles, maybe making some clothes, because a lot of Greeks make their own clothes. So the women would be doing that again, having the children and raising them, and working with the slaves, working to watch out over the slaves. We have documents of where men will say, well, your job as my wife is to look out for the slaves, so make sure that the slaves are healthy and they can do their work in the household, etc., etc. So maybe at best kind of a mini sort of manager of the household, but ultimately, of course, it's under the directorship of the male. So again, as I say, the big problem here when we try to unpack at least all that I've encountered, when we try to talk about, what was it like to be a woman at this time, we don't really have, as they say, we don't have the female voices themselves. We have a little bit of poetry and here and there, but by and large, we don't have large works. Like we don't have, as far as I know, we don't have a work like a Nicomachean Ethics or like a Politics written by a woman of the time, which is too bad because, it's terrible because then we lack that other viewpoint. What was it like to be an Athenian woman? We really only, all the information about Athenian women, it comes from male writers. Now, women, there's lots of female characters in classical literature, tons, and there's a spectrum of them. Some female characters in classical literature are, really meek and mild, all the stereotypes. You find all of them. And they're passive and they're exploited and all these kinds of awful things. So you have that. And then you have, on the other hand, some women that are, if you read Homer, like the Odyssey and what, you have very dangerous type of women. They're very powerful and they can do all kinds of horrible things. Probably extremes, not very terribly realistic representations. Either, terrible, stereotypical in terms of really, really passive, and stereotypical in terms of really, really, really powerful and dangerous. So, but nonetheless, you could make the argument, maybe in a small sense, that there's lots and lots of female characters in classical literature. But by and large, they were really concentrating on women being connected to the home and children. They maybe a small amount in some of Aristophanes. There's, I think in the Wasps, there's this one woman who seems to be participating in the life of the market. She sells a little bit of bread. She doesn't seem to be a female, like a female barbarian slave. Seems to be maybe part of a free household, a polis, and maybe, does a little bit of that. But by and large, Greek literature that Aristotle would have encountered. Now, Aristotle would have known a lot more classical literature than us, simply because a lot of it's been lost. But what we seem to see is that they concentrated on physical differences, just straight, lifting weights kind of stuff. And they moved, by and large, from these kinds of physical differences that were observable to postulate, to infer that there were all these intellectual differences as well. And the net result of their reasoning on this, for a variety of ways, is that women just come across as inferior to men. Right? That's how they saw things. Now, Plato is pointed out quite often as a bit of an exception. So there were exceptions. It's not the case that everyone bought into the same view. You can look through classical literature and find exceptions to these, where women do come across as not not inferior in any way. They can do these things as well as men. And Plato does say in a few places in his works that virtue in men is the same as virtue in women, and so that women can be in charge of the society, so that the physical body, Plato says, maybe women don't have the same brute strength that men do, but so what? So maybe you just don't have them doing the same kinds of physical labors. But certainly you could have women do the intellectual labors and, that kind of heavy lifting in society, and they're just as virtuous. They're not any different than men. In most of classical literature, though, it's not represented that way. All right, so a little bit more detail. Again, it's pretty sketchy, the evidence that we do have. And I just wanted to make a couple of distinctions here that we maybe can talk about a little bit, but again, always take this with a bit of a grain of salt, because the evidence is not as thick and as rich as we'd like, because again, we don't have, we have really nothing from women writers. So well-off women, what happened? Very young girls were married off, right? They had dowries to try and attract the best male suitors. Girls were, they weren't women, they were girls married off. They, barely had, 12, 13 years old, 14, very young, very, very young. And their goal, first off, was to get married and to produce children. So that was pretty dangerous. You had extremely young girls getting pregnant, and so that creates all kinds of problems, both intellectually, morally, and physically as well. So abortions were, natural abortions, miscarriages, things like that were common. Lots of women died in childbirth. Lots of babies died early, etc., etc. So it was pretty rough. The dowries were set up by the parents to attract the best suitors, and usually the men were older, so you would have men in their late 20s, early 30s. That was kind of, if you look in classical literature, even Plato, that's kind of the best time for men to get married, when they're a little bit more mature. And of course, as I pointed out in a previous video, a man, you want to marry your daughter off, provide a good dowry, but you wanted her to marry somebody that had some money and had a household that was set up, or at least could have the means to set up a household so that it could run. So you wanted a guy that was a little bit established in business. And so Plato says, that's sort of the end of your 20s where you get a good suitor for your daughter. That shows you that the marriages were often arranged. The young girl didn't have a say. It was basically the male who was in his 20s would talk to the parents, and they would cut some kind of a deal. There were laws about dowries, though, that because there was a large age difference, so a lot of young girls, they could be widowed very early. And because men didn't live that long at that time, so lots of guys died in their 40s and 50s. So you had to get established in business soon, because you could be dead when you're 45 or 50. Their lifespans weren't that long. So these young girls would be young women when they were widowed. So there were laws about dowries. Dowries had to be returned, or if divorces, there were divorce at that time, dowries had to be returned to the parents. And if the husband couldn't return the whole dowry, he could be he could be indebted for it and have to pay interest and things like that. So there were very minimum types of protections of wealth, but again, not a great deal for these young girls. Also, a lot of times people would want to keep the wealth in families, so they would be marrying their daughters off to close relatives. Certainly stuff we don't often see today. All right, so the key thing again for a young bride is to produce children, and as I mentioned, that could be dangerous. And because of high infant mortality rates, have to produce several children to get a couple that would survive. It was just simply the case that most children died very young. So it's a character in a play by Euripides, Medea. In the play by that name, Medea, says that she would rather be in battle. She would rather be in the front line of a battle 3, 4, 5 times over before giving birth once. So it's the fact that it was extraordinarily dangerous to get pregnant and try and give birth in ancient Greece was at least recognized, and that, of course, is coming from a male writer. So I would imagine that women knew that this was a big risk when they had children, and so these women were, but of course they were forced into it. It's not like they had options. The women seem to have, as I said, they were largely confined to the home. Some of the things that women had as legitimate ways to get out might have been, again, a little bit of selling what they made, or like bread or some textiles or whatnot. They might have been a little bit of that where they sold. A thing that also women seem to have done, acceptable social outlets for them. And again, these are women that are well off. They're wealthier women. They would be participating in religious services. So they were connected to some of the rituals that were at the time. So religious ceremonies, funerals. There wasn't a big funeral industry like we have today, right? If someone passes away, you call the funeral, and they look after all that stuff. Well, who did that in ancient Greece? Was there a large funeral industry? Well, it doesn't seem to be that there was. It was largely women that would prepare the body and get everything ready for a funeral. And we do have some excerpts and snippets of writing from the time that we think may have been women talking to each other or writing each other, or some kind of record of women saying things like, kind of like, see you at the next funeral, right? I don't get out that often, but when there is a death or whatever, the women would be able to talk to each other, and marriage ceremonies. So largely things connected to marriages, maybe birth celebrations, and funeral activities, but not just general socializing. No, women didn't really have that option. Again, these women that were widowed early, sometimes they'd be in their 20s, or they could be in their early 20s, depending on how old the man was. And if he was quite a bit older and he died early, well, a girl could be extremely young and be a widow. And a lot of those women were expected to remarry, and if they were still, of course, of childbearing years, a lot of them would be, so off they go, producing more children for the society. So they were expected to remarry. It was quite common that a lot of these women would remarry. There was also common law marriage, we think, of the time. This was all largely between maybe Athenian men and sometimes foreign women, and sometimes women who had no dowry. So there were a number of arrangements. So it wasn't just, women getting married and everything formal. There were some exceptions to this. All right, poorer women. Now, I put the term prostitution in scare quotes because, sometimes you say, oh, it's always a prostitute. You got to be careful with using that English word because it has always the connotation of exchange of sexual services for money. And that's not always what those poor women were doing. Sometimes it might have been selling like female companionship. Males would produce that. So it's not always clear. So we're going to be careful about always assuming it's a sex trade industry. It may not have been. We have a couple of women like Aspasia and Diotima that we do have some record of that show up in various writings by the male authors of the time. Again, that's really the only voices we have are male authors. But they do refer to some of these women as being quite well-educated. They weren't necessarily married. They're quite sophisticated, and they were sought out for their opinions. Plato refers to some women like that as being seriously thought of as having basically views of their own, and they seem to have been well-educated, literate women. So it's hard to say, again, because we don't have the voices from the women, like what exactly the complete picture was. We just unfortunately don't know. Who knows? Maybe someday in some obscure library, some manuscript might turn up. It's a happy thought, but one never knows these things. So the main point that I'm just trying to make is there might be some argument for the case that there were some women that could live sort of a different kind of lifestyle where they were well educated and could participate more maybe in this life of the polis, but it just doesn't seem to be generally the case. That was really the province of men. So the final word on the role of women in Athenian society, as far as I'm concerned, we can't say with absolute certainty in any way. There's just really not enough evidence to draw the conclusions. However, it seems relatively uncontroversial to say, by and large, it was an extremely patriarchal society, and by ours, how we would look at today, pretty sexist in its view of women, very limiting in the roles. And what we find that Aristotle is picking up on is this small role that women, it might have been important, yes, in the sense that they had to provide children, which keeps the society going, but it was extraordinarily limited and controlled. And of course, if a woman, if a couple, so male and female, they get married and children aren't forthcoming, males weren't blamed, the females were blamed, and so the males would try and find another female because it was always regarded as the woman's fault. So in the end, it was a pretty terrible thing to, regardless of what class, maybe with the odd exception, which you can't even be sure of, to be a woman in this society, because you were essentially forced into a very small range of living, and you were totally at the mercy of male control, and that seems to be fairly strongly indicated by the evidence. All right, so that wraps this up. So what I want to show later on is how Aristotle kind of absorbs a lot of this stuff. And again, it's not all complete because I pointed out there were some dissenting voices in this, although it's debatable how much Plato really was a feminist in any way. But certainly he said something like the notion of virtue itself could be in women in the same way as in men. So he didn't have necessarily a completely natural distinction between men and women. Aristotle, as we'll see, thinks that it is a distinction of nature that women are inferior, and he tries in the Politics to provide an argument for that. All right, so that wraps this up. See you next video.